under a flooded show cave in the English countryside, a body was waiting to prove exactly how wrong an entire nation had gotten its own ancestry. For over a century, Britain's oldest known skeleton was held up as evidence of an unbroken bloodline running straight through the English history, a founding father standing at the root of the family tree. That proof was never real. And when scientists finally tested it on a molecular level, what came back overturned a story one of the country's most respected scientific institutions had confidently signed off on back in 1914, using nothing more than a ruler and a skull. In 1997, a Somerset schoolteacher named Adrian Target sat in front of television cameras and was told his own DNA linked him in an unbroken line to that exact skeleton. It made him briefly famous, a living descendant of Britain's oldest man. It also turned out to rest on far shakier ground than anyone admitted at the time. The whole thing started in December 1903, when two brothers digging a drainage trench inside a Somerset cave hit something that wasn't rock. The cave was Gough's Cave, cut into the limestone walls of Cheddar Gorge, walls rising over 400 feet above the road, the whole gorge threaded with passages 500,000 years in the making. Somewhere below the surface, the Cheddar Yo, Britain's largest underground river, still moves through darkness nobody has fully mapped. By 1903, the cave was already a paying tourist attraction, run by two brothers, Arthur and William, who had inherited it from their father the year before and were competing directly against a rival show cave a short walk down the gorge. Their drainage trench was meant to solve a flooding problem, nothing more, a practical fix to stop water ruining the paying tour route. Instead, it exposed a near-complete skeleton, curled on its side about 20 meters inside the cave mouth, sealed under a crust of stalagmite that had formed, undisturbed, for thousands of years directly over the top of him. He had died young in his early 20s, standing around 5'5", at a time when simply reaching adulthood in post-glacial Britain was its own achievement. A crater-shaped wound above his right eye has never been fully explained. Infection, violence, or careless digging in 1903, nobody can say for certain. He was buried alone, without the grave goods common for the period. One early investigator guessed he had simply drowned and washed into the cave. A researcher looking at the same passage decades later argued the geography made that impossible, that someone had placed him there on purpose. If that's right, someone chose this spot for him, deliberately, in a way nobody alive can fully explain. Almost immediately, the story around him started growing bigger than the bones themselves. Newspapers didn't just call him old, they floated numbers as high as 80,000 years, guesses with no real method behind them, just confidence dressed up as science. He became known as the earliest Englishman, a title that did a lot of work in Edwardian Britain, a country obsessed with lineage, empire, and the idea that its people were the natural, permanent inheritors of this land. In 1914, one of the country's leading scientific institutions studied his skull using craniometry, the practice of judging ancestry, intelligence, and character from bone shape and proportion. It was standard academic method at the time. It's recognized today as pseudoscience, a tool that spent decades manufacturing so-called scientific justification for racial hierarchy across Europe and its empires. Their conclusion fit the mood of the era perfectly. His skull, they said, was long-headed, a shape they associated with medieval Englishmen. Case closed. An ancient forefather, scientifically confirmed, sitting quietly in a Somerset cave, waiting to be found by a country already eager to claim him. It wasn't closed. The first real correction came in the 1970s, when radiocarbon dating finally gave him an actual number instead of a guess. The method is simple in principle. Living things absorb a radioactive form of carbon while alive, and that carbon decays at a fixed, known rate the moment they die. So measuring what's left tells you roughly how long ago death happened. Bone collagen from his leg tested at roughly 9,000 years old. A later test, using more advanced technology, confirmed a similar range, not 80,000 years, still staggeringly old enough to place him at the edge of the last ice age, among the first people to resettle Britain once the glaciers retreated. But the original claim used to crown him the earliest Englishman had been wrong by tens of thousands of years, and nobody had caught it for 7 decades. A national symbol, built on an invented number, had stood unchallenged for most of the 20th century, because an ancient homegrown forefather fit neatly into a story Britain was already telling about itself. A story about deep, deserved roots, about a people naturally suited to rule half the globe because they'd apparently been standing on this exact soil since the dawn of time. There's a reason so much of that story went unchecked for so long. Cave excavation in this period wasn't careful archaeology. It was commercial digging, done fast, to open new tunnels for paying tourists before the next holiday season. Bones, teeth, and worked flints were reportedly hauled out by the wheelbarrow load and simply discarded, because nobody thought the surrounding context mattered as much as the spectacle waiting at the end of the tour. Whatever evidence might have explained who this man really was, the exact conditions of his burial, what else was sitting in that layer of the cave floor, got lost before anyone thought to record it properly. What survived was the skeleton itself, and the assumptions people were free to build around it, unchecked for generations. Then, in 1996, the story took a turn that made him famous all over again, and this time it felt personal. Geneticist Brian Sykes extracted mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down through the maternal line, from one of the skeleton's molars. For a regional television program, his team went door to door in the village of Cheddar, swabbing saliva from local residents, treating a documentary shoot like a genetic manhunt. And they got a hit. Adrian Target, a local history teacher, carried the same maternal marker as the 10,000-year-old man pulled from the cave drain. Cameras caught the moment he found out. The story exploded internationally within days. Newspapers in Britain and the United States ran it as proof of an unbroken bloodline, a living descendant standing a few hundred meters from his ancestor's grave, roughly 300 generations of continuous ancestry in one Somerset village. It's a wonderful story. It was also never peer-reviewed. The marker involved, haplogroup U5, was carried by a large share, potentially 2/3 or more, of all hunter-gatherers alive in that era, shared by an enormous number of people, not just one schoolteacher in one village. A shared haplogroup means a distant common ancestor, potentially thousands of years back, not a direct, unbroken line. But the made-for-television framing was simply too good to correct. For 20 years, the man's descendant lives half a mile from his grave, stood as accepted fact, repeated in documentaries, books, and tourist plaques, while nobody did the deeper genetic work that would actually test what he looked like, where his ancestry really connected, or whether the comforting village story held up under real scrutiny. Nobody had opened his genome. For over a century, everything the public believed about this man, his age, his identity, his descendants, rested on skull measurements taken with pseudoscience, one shared maternal marker, and a story built for a regional TV special that never went through peer review. That was about to change, and when it didn't just correct a date, it attacked the entire foundation the earliest Englishman myth had been quietly built on for 11 decades. In 2018, ahead of a Channel 4 documentary, researchers at London's Natural History Museum decided to finally sequence the whole genome, not just a fragment, the entire code. Geneticist Selena Brace and her team targeted the petrous bone, the densest, most protected structure in the human skull, tucked behind the ear, because it happens to preserve ancient DNA better than almost any other bone in the body. They drilled a hole barely 2 millimeters wide and extracted a few milligrams of pale powder, all that was needed. From it came the highest coverage genome ever recovered from a Mesolithic-era European skeleton at the time, a genetic record more detailed than anything the 20th century could have produced. 10,000 years of silence and suddenly, a readable code. Sequencing alone doesn't tell you what someone looked like. For that, the team used a forensic tool called HirisPlex S, built originally for police work, designed to predict a suspect's likely eye color, hair color, and skin tone directly from DNA traces left behind at a crime scene. Nobody had pointed a tool built for modern forensics at a 10,000-year-old skeleton with this level of confidence before. The result came back clear on 2 points and striking on a third. Blue or green eyes, dark curly hair, and skin most likely falling into one of the 2 darkest categories the model could return. A bracket researchers described publicly as dark to black. A pair of reconstruction artists sculpted a full-scale bust from the results, and the museum unveiled it to the public alongside the genome findings. It looked nothing like the earliest Englishmen imagined for over a century. It looked nothing like earlier reconstructions built before the genome existed, ones that had simply defaulted to lighter skin, because that's what people expected an ancient Britain to look like, with no genetic evidence behind the choice at all. This time was different. This was a genetic prediction, cross-checked against other Mesolithic hunter-gatherer genomes recovered from sites across Spain, Luxembourg, and Hungary, all showing the same basic pattern: dark skin, pale eyes, not a coincidence confined to one skeleton in one cave. A population-wide trait, stretching across an entire continent of early hunter-gatherers, that 100 years of assumption had simply never accounted for. Read that again. The skeleton once used to prove an unbroken white British bloodline had just returned a genetic profile that undercut the entire premise the myth was built on. And that raises an uncomfortable question about the century that came before. Nobody had deliberately hidden this. There was no locked archive, no suppressed report. It was simpler, and in some ways worse than that. For 100 years, nobody in a position to check had bothered to look closely enough to be wrong out loud. The assumption did the work that evidence should have been doing. That should have been the whole headline, clean and simple. It wasn't because science, done properly, doesn't hand you a clean headline. Within weeks, Susan Walsh, one of the researchers who helped develop the very tool used in the analysis, pointed out that the result was a probability, the most likely profile drawn from a statistical model, not a definitive photograph pulled directly from ancient bone. It's not a simple, one-word statement of skin color, she said. It's a most probable profile built on current research, and current research keeps moving. Other geneticists, with no connection to the original study, raised the same concern, warning publicly that the field isn't yet ready to predict exact prehistoric skin color from genetics alone, because pigmentation genetics turn out to be far more complicated than most people assumed. The tool itself had been built and validated mainly on modern populations for forensic casework, not designed from the ground up for millennia-old, fragmentary genetic material with missing markers and degraded coverage. Here's the distinction almost nobody preserved, and it's one the loudest voices on both sides of the story tend to skip. The core finding held up. He lacked the specific genetic markers responsible for light skin in modern Europeans, the same pattern found in other hunter-gatherers from across the continent. That part isn't in dispute. What stayed genuinely uncertain was the precise shade, dark, or the darkest possible category, a distinction that matters for scientific precision, but got flattened in the public conversation almost instantly. The museum has had to keep publicly clarifying that the study was never withdrawn, never debunked, exactly as reported. The uncertainty was always about how dark, never about whether he was significantly darker than the earliest Englishman everyone had pictured for a century. The public reaction split into two camps, and both said more about the present than the past. Far-right commentators called the study a hoax, a manufactured result designed to serve a political agenda around modern immigration and national identity. One American political figure, already known for anti-Semitic and extremist posting, was banned from social media after mocking the findings with a doctored image, framing the genome as an attack on real Britons. That wasn't scientific skepticism. It was documented, public denial of a peer-reviewed result, rejected not because the method was flawed, but because the conclusion was politically inconvenient. Years later, some cultural retelling swung the other way, claiming Britain had been black for 7,000 years before anyone else arrived, language that historians and commentators pointed out runs well past what the genome can actually prove. Cheddar Man's population, the Western hunter-gatherers of Ice Age Europe, had no connection to sub-Saharan African ancestry at all. They were genetically a dark-skinned, pale-eyed population ancestral to modern Northern Europeans, who simply hadn't yet evolved the light-skinned variants that later became common. A different claim entirely, stretched to fit a headline it was never built to support. Tom Booth, part of the museum's own research team, put it plainly in public commentary. The racial categories people carry around today are recent, cultural constructions, only a few centuries old at most, and applying them backward onto a 10,000-year-old hunter-gatherer misunderstands the biology entirely. These imaginary categories, he said, aren't applicable to the deep past at all. This didn't prove any modern political claim. It proved that the quiet assumption baked into earliest Englishmen, the expectation that ancient automatically meant pale, was never something the science actually supported. It was something people supplied on their own unconsciously, since a spade struck bone in 1903. If he wasn't the ancestor people had imagined for over a century, a harder question follows right behind it. Where did the pale skin, the blonde and red hair, the traits associated with typically British ancestry actually come from? The answer turned out to be even stranger than the pigmentation reveal itself, because it meant the myth wasn't just wrong about his skin color. It was wrong about the entire relationship between Cheddar Man and modern Britain. A follow-up peer-reviewed study, published by the same museum team in 2019, mapped what actually happened to Britain's population in the thousands of years after his time. His people, the Western hunter-gatherers, were not simply the ancestors of everyone who came later, quietly absorbed into the bloodline as generations passed. Roughly 6,000 years ago, farmers of mainly Aegean and Anatolian ancestry migrated into Britain by sea, and according to the genetic evidence, largely replaced the existing population rather than blending gradually into it. Unlike other parts of continental Europe where hunter-gatherer genes made at least a partial comeback over time, Britain shows almost no resurgence at all. The farmers who introduced agriculture, built the island's earliest monuments, and whose descendants would eventually raise Stonehenge itself, carried forward strikingly little of Cheddar Man's genetic legacy. The island had been quietly, almost completely, repopulated. Then it happened again. A large 2018 genetic study of what's known as the Beaker phenomenon, named for a distinctive style of bell-shaped pottery that spread across Bronze Age Europe, found that roughly 4,400 years ago, migrants carrying heavy steppe ancestry, genetically linked to pastoralist populations from far to the east, moved into Britain in large numbers, bringing new burial customs, new metalworking, and new genes. The data suggests a population turnover of around 90% within a few hundred years. 90%. Not a slow blend of cultures across generations. A near total genetic replacement, happening twice within the span of a few thousand years, each incoming wave arriving lighter skinned than the population it displaced and absorbed. The light skin, now considered typically British, didn't descend from Cheddar Man in an unbroken line at all. It arrived later, carried in by two separate migrations, layered on top of a population that had already been almost entirely replaced. Researchers linked the spread of lighter pigmentation partly to a simple survival pressure, the vitamin D hypothesis, the idea that as populations moved into higher latitudes with weaker, less direct sunlight, lighter skin which absorbs ultraviolet light more efficiently, offered a genuine advantage for producing enough vitamin D to survive and reproduce. It wasn't sudden. It was generations of quiet selection pressure, layered on top of 2 population replacements, not one continuous inheritance from Britain's original hunter-gatherers. The Natural History Museum's own estimate is blunt about it. People without recent migration history carry roughly 10% ancestry traceable to Cheddar Man's broad population, and even most of that arrived secondhand, already mixed into the DNA of the farmers and steppe migrants who replaced his people in the first place. Sit with that for a moment. The skeleton once used to symbolize an unbroken bloodline turns out to represent a population that was almost entirely erased from the island's gene pool, twice, in 2 separate waves, thousands of years apart. 2 revelations, stacked on top of each other, each one dismantling a different piece of the original myth. First, the ancient Britain wasn't pale. The pigmentation everyone assumed as a baseline was itself a later arrival. Second, modern Britain barely descends from him in any direct sense anyway, regardless of what he looked like. Whichever version of the authentic ancestor story you happen to be attached to, pale skin or unbroken lineage, the genome quietly took both of them apart. Later research pushed the pattern even further back than anyone expected. A 2025 study analyzing pigmentation genetics across roughly 348 ancient European genomes, spanning tens of thousands of years, found that around 92% of Paleolithic Europeans likely had dark skin, with none falling into the palest category the model could measure. Even by the Iron Age, just a few thousand years ago, over half the population studied still carried dark or intermediate pigmentation. Light skin, the trait people had assumed was ancient, deep, and defining, only became dominant across Europe roughly 3,000 years ago, a genetic blink of an eye compared to the tens of thousands of years humans had already been living on the continent. That same study also flagged the exact methodological risk raised back in 2018, that pigmentation predictions built from low coverage, degraded ancient DNA, exactly the situation with Cheddar Man's original sample, carry real uncertainty if handled carelessly. The scientists urging patience in 2018 weren't obstructing the truth. They were protecting it. The broad picture held up and strengthened considerably. The precise, forensic-grade certainty some early headlines implied never fully existed in the first place. Deeper in the same cave system, archaeologists have recovered human remains dated to roughly 14,700 years ago, nearly 5,000 years before Cheddar Man was even born. Those bones show unmistakable signs of deliberate defleshing, cut marks consistent with butchery, marrow extraction from long bones, and skulls carefully modified into what researchers call skull cups, drinking or ceremonial vessels shaped from human craniums, the earliest directly dated example of the practice found anywhere in the world. Most interpretations point toward ritual behavior rather than starvation, some kind of funerary practice this culture used to process its own dead, though the full meaning is still argued over. This is not Cheddar Man's story. Genetically and chronologically, it belongs to an entirely different population, one that lived, died, and vanished inside this cave millennia before the skeleton, pulled from the drainage trench, was ever born. But it's worth knowing it's there, sealed in the same rock, a second secret sitting meters from the first, waiting for its own documentary, its own reckoning. Today, Cheddar Man's actual skeleton rests inside the Natural History Museum, in the Human Evolution Gallery, on long-term loan from a private estate that has technically owned the remains since long before the genome ever existed, and could, in principle, reclaim them at any time. Ownership of Britain's oldest complete human being, it turns out, sits not with the nation, not with the cave where he was found, but with a private landowner, a detail almost nobody outside the museum world ever thinks to question. A cast sits back in Cheddar Gorge, positioned exactly where he was originally uncovered in that drainage trench in 1903, a stand-in for a body that no longer legally belongs to the place that made it famous. Tourists still walk that same passage today, past the exact stretch of trench two brothers once dug to solve a plumbing problem. Entirely unaware, they're standing at the center of a genetic argument that reshaped how an entire country thinks about its own deep past. In London, visitors can stand between two versions of the same man, the real bones, curled the way he was discovered, silent under carefully controlled lighting, and the reconstruction, dark-skinned, pale-eyed, built entirely from his own DNA rather than inherited assumption. The museum's own materials are careful to note the exact shade remains a probability, not a certainty, caution that never quite survives translation into a viral headline. This was never really a story about paint-by-numbers skin tone. It was a story about how confidently a country constructed an identity, national, racial, ancestral, around a body it had barely bothered to properly test. The drainage trench dug by two brothers in December 1903 was meant to solve a simple practical problem: keep water out of a cave. People wanted to keep charging tourists to walk through. Instead, it opened a body that would spend the next century being claimed, misdated, misread, and eventually genetically interrogated in ways nobody standing in that flooded passage could have possibly imagined. Every correction along the way, the radiocarbon date, the debunked craniometry, the overstated descendant story, the genome, the pushback on the genome, the deeper ancestry map that followed, chipped away at a story Britain had told itself out of pride rather than proof. He survived the last ice age. He survived collapse, replacement, and near total genetic erasure from the population that followed him, twice over. He survived being wheelbarrowed out of context by men chasing tourist revenue, and reassembled under assumptions that had nothing to do with who he actually was. He survived a schoolteacher being crowned his descendant on television, on a claim that never held up once anyone actually checked it. And he survived long enough to end up behind reinforced glass in London, a few feet from a face rebuilt entirely from his own DNA, still asking the question his original discoverers never thought to ask in 1903. Britain didn't inherit an ancestor here. It inherited a mirror and spent 100 years arguing with its own reflection instead of checking the glass. If this pulled the thread on a story you thought was already settled, subscribe for the next one and let me know in the comments what you think Britain got more wrong, his face, or his family tree.